Hi guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and we are going to talk about the foreign policy initiatives under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy. And you're going to see a lot of differences between Truman, who was in office prior to President Eisenhower, and some of the new additions to the war on communism or the Cold War under Eisenhower. So, difference number one, Eisenhower developed more nuclear weapons. And the reason for that was this idea of both brinkmanship and massive retaliation. So, if the United States were to push a communist country to the brink of war, we knew or hoped that that country would back down. Because if we have a strong nuclear arsenal, they would be afraid of massive retaliation and that we would use these nuclear weapons. So this policy was driven by Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. And again, driving countries to the brink, those countries will back down as long as we have a stronger arsenal, because nobody wants us to retaliate with nuclear weapons. And in 1953, we successfully tested our first hydrogen bomb. And in order to continue to fund the development of our nuclear arsenal, Eisenhower committed more money to those projects. The second difference between Truman and Eisenhower is that Eisenhower uses the power of the CIA, which, as we know, is a government agency that is often very secretive. And one of the uses of the CIA in the 1950s was to overthrow governments around the world that we believed did not have American interests at heart. So these countries aren't necessarily communist per se, but we overthrow both Iran and Guatemala in the 1950s. Specifically in Iran, there was a leader who was looking to maybe drive out the British and the Americans in terms of our purchase of oil. And so the CIA basically overthrew the government, implemented a new leader that would be more agreeable to working with both the British and the Americans, and who wouldn't try to limit oil control in Iran. We are successful in doing this, and the government stays this way until 1979. Now, fun fact, the CIA operative who was in charge of this, Operation Ajax, was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit. In addition to that, Eisenhower has to deal with Asia and the Middle East. So whereas Truman was really focused on containing communism in Europe, Eisenhower is going to take that idea of containment and apply it to both Asia and the Middle East. So when it comes to Asia, we know that under Truman, the Korean War began. Under Eisenhower's presidency, he deals with the Korean Armistice. And in 1953, both sides, the communist-controlled North and the Democratic-controlled South, just basically stopped fighting. And the country redrew their division along the 38th parallel, as you can see here on the left. And to this very day, that is how Korea is set up. There was no peace treaty. There was no specific end to the war. It was just an armistice, cease of fighting, if you will. And like I said, excuse me, today the country remains divided. Additionally, Eisenhower saw the same issue taking shape in Vietnam. And Vietnam, after World War II, had been controlled in the North by communists and in the South by Democrats. And they were divided along the 17th parallel. And there was supposed to be elections held to hopefully find one leader for the entire country. However, Eisenhower knew that keeping our eye on Vietnam was really important, and he referred to Southeast Asia as basically a set of dominoes, that if one country fell to communism, they're all going to fall to communism, so we better make sure that doesn't happen. And that's often referred to as the domino theory. In order to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism, between 1955 and 1961, the United States pledged $1 billion in aid to South Vietnam. And we also signed a SEATO pact, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, with the French, the British, New Zealand, Thailand, Australia, Pakistan, and the Philippines. And we basically said that if we were to go in and fight communism, we would have each other's back. Additionally, as I mentioned, another difference between Truman and Eisenhower is that Eisenhower also focuses his attention on the Middle East, specifically when it came to countries that were maybe vulnerable to communism. So he pledged economic aid to any country that was threatened by communism. So similar to Truman, but in a different area of the world. And then, of course, Eisenhower had to deal with the space race. So when it came to the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, the kind of unofficial idea was that whomever could launch satellites, people, etc., into space meant that they had developed missile technology that could be used for nuclear weapons. So in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite into orbit, Sputnik, the United States responded in two ways. Number one, they began to allocate more money to math and science programs and increased educational requirements in those areas in schools across the country. And we also created NASA, our space agency, to continue to research and develop our own space program. And we believe we met that challenge by putting, obviously, the first humans on the moon in July of 1969. So the space race is a common theme between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. Looking back on his presidency, Eisenhower does give a farewell address in which he mentions something called the military-industrial complex. And as a president who created a military-industrial complex and devoted money to defense contracts, the development of nuclear weapons, etc., kind of looking back, he said, you know what? It's great to have a prepared military. It's great to, spend money on defense, but we need to make sure that this does not become the sole priority of the United States. And what's interesting is that, as you guys may know, defense spending is still far and away one of the biggest programs we spend money on today. So he was kind of foreshadowing that in 1960. When John F. Kennedy comes into office, obviously his tenure in office is much shorter, given his untimely death in 1963, but his policies are different from both that of Truman and Eisenhower. He does understand the importance of developing nuclear weapons, and he refers to that as mutual assured destruction, that as long as we're on par with the Soviet Union, if we have the same or similar nuclear arsenals, we probably won't use them against each other because we know if one uses them, the other will respond and both will be mutually destructive. He also believes in something called a flexible response, meaning he's not going to always use military force when it comes to the Soviet Union or communist countries, but he's willing to try things like economic sanctions as well as diplomacy to try and get his point across. Now, while he's in office, he has to deal with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who kind of becomes his number one adversary. And the reason for that really falls in Cuba. So in 1959, Cuba fell to communism, and Fidel Castro became a very outspoken communist leader of Cuba. This was very much a top priority for the United States because, as you guys can see here, Cuba lies 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So that communist country was a little too close for America's liking. Similarly to Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy used the power of the CIA and essentially tried to overthrow Fidel Castro in 1961. And this became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a huge failure, and ultimately this only increased tension between the United States and Cuba, and as you're going to see here, the Soviet Union. So in 1962, we had a couple of reconnaissance planes take photos over Cuba, and we saw missile launch sites in Cuba. And what we found was that the Soviet Union was stationing both medium range and intermediate range ballistics missiles in Cuba. Well, if you guys look at this map, if those missiles are ever fired, I mean, they could hit every area of the United States. So this becomes a problem. And as more Soviet ships get closer to Cuba to bring these missiles into Cuba, the United States has to make some pretty tough decisions. So John F. Kennedy considers a wide variety of options. We could bomb these missile sites. We could invade Cuba. But what he decides is kind of a healthy medium, and he decides to impose a naval blockade around Cuba. So as the United States Navy surrounds Cuba, as the Soviet ships get closer and closer, for about 13 days, everybody's kind of, watching with bated breath. What's going to happen? Are these ships going to engage? Are we on the brink, literally, of nuclear warfare? Thanks to some behind-the-scenes negotiating with Nikita Khrushchev and Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, they secretly agreed that the United States would remove the missiles that we had in Turkey that were aimed at the Soviet Union, as long as the Soviet ships turned around and removed their missiles out of Cuba. So that negotiation wasn't necessarily made public. The United States was really publicly considered to be the victor because the Soviet ships did turn around. But again, secretly, we were doing the same thing in Europe. And so we essentially removed our missiles in Turkey while they removed their missiles in Cuba, and we were able to avoid a nuclear conflict. Okay, so guys, to wrap up, just a couple of things. Eisenhower really takes the Cold War and tries to contain communism in areas like Asia and the Middle East. He develops our nuclear arsenal. Kennedy is a little more flexible in his response and kind of handles situations as they pop up. But hopefully that gives you guys kind of a comprehensive overview of how these two gentlemen handled the containment of communism during the Cold War.